So, I want to talk today about a woman that you've probably never heard that much about. She doesn't have a name in the history books. She's not a queen. She's not a countess. She didn't marry the wrong king or get executed for treason. She ran a manor house in Tudor England, and right now, in early June, she is in a race against the clock that she cannot afford to lose. Because something about summer in Tudor England that we don't really think about is that summer wasn't a break. Summer wasn't holidays and picnics and lazy afternoons. Summer was the most intense working season of the year for the woman who ran the household, and specifically for the woman who ran the still room. And the reason is simple: the plants were not going to wait for her. Everything that the household needed to stay healthy, smell acceptable, preserve food, treat illness, and basically survive the next 12 months was going to be produced in roughly a 4-month window. Miss the rose harvest by a week, and there's no rose water until 1537. Miss the lavender, and there's nothing to keep the plague away in October. No popping off to Boots, no Amazon next day delivery, just her recipe book, her copper still, and the calendar. So get comfy, settle in. Today we are going to chat about the Tudor still room and the woman who ran it. Hey friend, welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast. If you are new here, very warm welcome to you. I'm Heather. I make videos and podcasts about Tudor history and medieval history and all kinds of women's history, and this is exactly the kind of story that I find completely irresistible. So hit subscribe if that sounds like your thing, and let's get into her day. So, it starts before sunrise in the garden. It's early June, somewhere in the 1530s, a manor house in England, and she is already up. Not because she's a morning person necessarily, but because the plants demand it. Here is something I did not know before I researched this episode. Herbs hold the highest concentration of essential oils right after the morning dew has dried, before the heat of the day burns off. In the cooler overnight temperatures, the plants recover from daytime stress and essentially concentrate all of their goodness. Once the midday sun hits, those volatile oils start evaporating, and you can actually smell it happening if you're in an herb garden on a hot afternoon. The scent gets fainter as the day goes on. So she's out there early morning, cutting stems just above the leaves, selecting the flowers that are mostly open but not fully bloomed, because fully bloomed means past peak. She's moving fast and she knows exactly what she's doing. This is not a leisurely stroll through the garden in the morning, listening to the birds and having a walking meditation. No. This is precision harvesting. And what is she harvesting in early June specifically? Roses, first and foremost. Roses are the big early June job, and I want to come back to those because rose water is basically the Tudor household's answer to everything. Also lavender, rosemary, sage, marigold, angelica, heartsease, each one going into a different basket because each one has a completely different job. Some are medicine. Some are for strewing on the floors. Some are for the kitchen. Some are for cosmetics. Some are for preserving food. She keeps them all separate because mixing them up at this stage means chaos later. She knows all of this because her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her, and it goes back generations and generations. But there's also something else going on here too, something that changed dramatically in her lifetime, and we need to talk about it. So that would be the monastery problem. Because here's the thing that reframes this entire episode. Before Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the monks and the nuns had all of this covered. Monasteries had herb gardens, dispensaries, still rooms, and the knowledge to run them. They treated the sick, they prepared medicines, they provided what was essentially a free community health service that had been operating for centuries. If you were ill or your household was ill, the monastery was part of your support system. And then Henry VIII goes and dissolves them, and between 1536 and 1541, all of that disappears. The monks are gone, the nuns are gone, the herb gardens are abandoned or taken over, and crucially, the free medical service vanishes with them. So where does all of that knowledge go? Well, it goes into the household, into our friend, the still room mistress's hands, into her recipe book, into the still room itself. This is why the Tudor still room mistress is carrying so much more responsibility than you might expect from someone who looks, on the surface, like she's just making jam and lavender sachets. She's filling a gap that Henry VIII created. She's now the household's doctor, pharmacist, medical supply chain, all rolled into one, and summer is when she stocks the shelves. Her recipe book is her most prized possession. It's handwritten, passed from mother to daughter, constantly updated and added to. It contains medicine, cosmetics, cleaning recipes, preserving techniques, and a fair amount of what we would now call superstition mixed in with what actually works. Tudor Herbals, the published books available to her, describe each herb's uses and even advised on when to harvest according to the alignment of the stars. She consults the book constantly. She argues with it occasionally. She adds to it when she discovers something new. It is, in a very real sense, her expertise made physical. So let's talk about where she's spending most of her day, because the still room is fascinating. It's a separate room from the main kitchen. It has its own fireplace, its own work table, its own copper still, shelves from floor to ceiling, storage cupboards, and racks overhead for hanging the herbs that she's just brought in to dry. It smells extraordinary in the summer. Roses and lavender and rosemary and something always simmering, and underneath it all, that slightly medicinal herbal smell that means serious business is happening here. This is her domain. Nobody comes in here without her permission, not even the cook. One of my favorite details from the research on this is that the still room was originally the lady of the house's personal workspace, going right back to medieval times. Over time, in larger households, it moved to the housekeeper or a dedicated stillroom maid. But in a typical Tudor manor house, this is the mistress herself, sleeves rolled up, managing everything. The Wikipedia article on still rooms described it as part chemistry lab, part compounding pharmacy, part perfumery, part beverage factory, and part kitchen. So what is she actually making today? Let's start with the rosewater because it is a perfect example of how Tudor households thought about their resources. Rosewater is made by distilling fresh rose petals over water in the copper still. It takes hours. The petals have to be fresh, which is why the morning harvest matters so much. And the roses only peak for a few weeks in early June. So this is happening right now, or it's not happening at all. And rosewater goes into everything. It's a medicine. It's used for eye complaints, headaches, and digestive problems. It's a cosmetic used in face creams and washes. It's a cooking ingredient used in sweet dishes and sauces. It's a cleaning product used to scent linens and rooms. It is the Tudor household all-purpose product, and our stillroom mistress needs gallons of it. Actual gallons, enough to last until next June. While the still is running, she's also tying herbs into bundles and hanging them from ceiling racks to dry. Lavender for scented sachets and medicine for strewing, rosemary for cooking and for medicine, sage, thyme, chamomile, mint. Each bundle tied tightly enough to dry without molding, not so tightly that the air can't circulate. She has done this thousands of times. Her hands know exactly how much pressure to use. A quick break, and then we're getting into the cosmetic situation, which is where things get very alarming. If you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into the lives of ordinary Tudor women who don't usually make it into the history books, the best thing you can do to help this channel is to subscribe. It's free, it helps more people find the videos, and it means that you won't miss what's coming next. Okay, back to the alarming cosmetics. I want to pause on the cosmetics she's making because this is where the story takes a turn. On the harmless end of the spectrum, she's producing rosewater washes, lavender-scented oils, herbal creams for chapped skin, tooth powders made from sage and salt, all perfectly reasonable. Some of it actually works by modern standards too, because lavender and thyme and sage have antibacterial properties, even if she doesn't know the mechanism. But the Tudor beauty ideal, particularly for fashionable households with connections to court, was extremely white skin. Extremely white skin meant that you were not out in the sun laboring. So it meant you were higher class. You could spend your day indoors, not out in that, ghastly sun doing farm work. And achieving extremely white skin involved ingredients that we now know were slowly poisoning people. The product was called ceruse, made from white lead and vinegar. And it was applied to the face, the neck, the hands. It gave a smooth, chalky finish, and it covered the scars left by smallpox, which was everywhere. The lead seeped into the skin, slowly causing muscle weakness, gum decay, cognitive decline, and eventually death. And the terrible irony is that lead corrodes the skin over time. So the more ceruse you used, the worse your skin got underneath, so you needed more ceruse to cover it up. It was a trap. The lip color contained vermilion, which was made from mercury sulfide. Mercury is highly toxic. Long-term exposure caused tremors, mood swings, and what contemporaries would have described as madness. Just reading all that reminds me of like the pharmaceutical ads that you see on TV. So I thought I would make a sample one. Vermilion is a vibrant red pigment derived from mercury sulfide, perfect for achieving the bold, seductive lip color favored by the fashionable ladies of quality. Simply mix with fats, oils, or beeswax for a rich, long-lasting color that really stands out against your ceruse-whitened complexion. Vermilion is not recommended for those who wish to avoid tremors, mood swings, memory loss, skin damage, or what contemporaries may describe as concerning change in personality. Long-term use may result in irritability, depression, and progressive neurological decline. Some users have reported difficulty walking, speaking, and recognizing loved ones. In rare cases, vermilion may cause death, though users should note that death was also frequently caused by smallpox, plague, sweating sickness, and childbirth, so you know swings and roundabouts. Vermilion should not be combined with ceruse, though we understand it will be. Users who experience blackening of teeth, loosening of the gums, or the sensation that their face is slowly dissolving should consult their stillroom mistress, who will probably give them more vermilion because nobody knew yet that this is the problem. Vermilion, when you want to look absolutely incredible at dinner. Results may vary. The Tudor stillroom accepts no liability for outcomes. God's will be done. Okay, that was fun, but there is nuance. Like, everything has nuance. In our 1530s manor house setting, the really heavy lead cosmetics were more of a fashionable upper-class trend than standard practice. This was before Elizabeth I made the full painted white face truly ubiquitous at court. But if our stillroom mistress was producing cosmetics for a fashionable household with court connections, these recipes were in the book that she was working from. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was following instructions that had been passed down for generations, with no knowledge of the damage that they caused. The intention was care. The outcome was harm. Tudor history is full of these kinds of moments. So around midday comes the part of the day that she finds most aggravating. She needs the big kitchen fireplace. The cook also needs the big kitchen fireplace. In a wealthy household, there might be a separate stillroom hearth, and this problem doesn't arise. But in most Tudor manor houses, there's one main fireplace that everything depends on. And in the summer, when she's distilling and preserving and the kitchen is also in full production, this becomes a daily territorial dispute. Distilling requires sustained heat for hours. You can't just nip in for 20 minutes and then hand it back. Preserving fruit and making cordials requires the same. The cook has entirely legitimate competing demands. Somebody's dinner needs to be made. Now, she usually wins this argument because the mistress of the house outranks the cook, but it is never graceful and it eats into her day. I love this detail because it's such a human and recognizable thing. Two professionals with completely legitimate needs fighting over one resource. Some things don't really ever change. Then we have the afternoon, the medicine chest. And this is where the stakes of the whole day become the most visible. She's filling the medicine chest, and in early summer in Tudor England, the medicine chest matters enormously because summer is plague season. London was pretty much unbearable to be in from around May until October. Plague was rife, the heat doing nothing good for a city with open sewage running through the streets. The royal court itself left London every summer partly to escape it. In 1535, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn had to reroute their entire summer progress to avoid plague-stricken towns, including abandoning Bristol altogether when the disease broke out there. They also rerouted the final leg to avoid Farnham and Guildford. Plague was redirecting the King of England's travel plans. This is how serious it was. And of course, there was the sweating sickness, which we talked about in one of the videos last week, one of the most feared summer diseases. It was said that this malady was so cruel it killed some within 2 hours. Some were merry at dinner and dead at supper. If the plague came to the manor house, our stillroom mistress was the first line of defense. The herbs that she was preserving right now were what stood between the household and plague. Plague water was a distilled herbal preparation that Tudors believed would protect against or treat infection. Fever remedies, treatments for digestive complaints that the summer heat brought, remedies for headaches, for toothaches, for sleeplessness, wound salves that actually do have some antimicrobial properties because many of the herbs that she's working with, like we said, lavender, thyme, and sage, really have antibacterial effects, even if she doesn't know it. And she's making strewing herbs. This sounds quite quaint until you understand the logic. Strewing herbs are fragrant plants, lavender, marjoram, basil, sweet fennel, that get scattered on the floors and in the rushes throughout the house. In the summer, when the windows are open and there's flies everywhere and the smells of the household without modern sanitation are at their peak, strewing herbs do real work. They deter insects. They mask odors. They were believed to protect against the bad air that the Tudors associated with disease. They weren't entirely wrong about the connection, even if they didn't understand the mechanism. Cleaner smelling air often did mean healthier air. Every jar that she fills right now is a small act of care for the people who depend on her. By the evening, the still has been cleaned and put away. The morning's harvest is hanging to dry or already processed. The rose water is cooling in its jars, the medicine chest has some new additions, and the kitchen has its fireplace back. And she's sitting down with her ledger, because she's not just a healer and a distiller or a preserving expert. She is running a production operation and she tracks it like one. What was harvested today and in what quantities? What was processed and what's still waiting? What's stored? What's drying? What needs to be done tomorrow before the weather changes? How much of last year's supply is left? What will run out first? What she still needs to make before September. She's doing inventory management for a pharmaceutical and food preservation business simultaneously by candlelight after what has been a 12-hour physical day. And then she opens the recipe book and adds to it a note on the rosewater batch, whether the still ran hotter or cooler than usual, whether the petals were at peak or slightly past, something she wants to try differently next time. Advice, essentially, to her future self or to whoever comes after her. And then she goes to bed because tomorrow the dew will dry off the herbs at 6 a.m. and she will need to be in the garden before the heat of the day. So here's why I love the Tudor stillroom mistress. She has no name in history books. She didn't do anything dramatic enough to get written down by chroniclers. She didn't, like I say, fall in love with a king or lead a rebellion or get burned at the stake. She just showed up every day in her stillroom and kept the people around her alive. The medicine that she made was what stood between the household and a fever with no treatment. The knowledge that she carried, handwritten in that recipe book, was the accumulated wisdom of generations of women. This tradition went back centuries before Henry VIII was even born, but the dissolution of the monasteries had raised the stakes enormously. The monastery had been the backup, the safety net, the place you turned when the household's own medicine wasn't enough, and now that was gone. So what she was doing in this still room was what it always had been, and now it was also all that there was. She was the household's doctor, pharmacist, food scientist, and cosmetics producer. She understood plants in a way that most people today couldn't even begin to match. She ran her operation with the precision of someone who knew that getting it wrong had consequences that she was not willing to accept. And she did it every summer in a race against the calendar while the roses were blooming and the lavender was ready and the clock was ticking. Something super fun. We are going to have an herbalists guild at TudorCon this year doing some demonstrations, and they are going to bring with them, I believe, their pop-up apothecary. So that's going to be super fun for people who come to TudorCon. And of course, we'll be interviewing them if you come to TudorCon from home, so you can still, kind of experience it online. But if you come to TudorCon, and you totally should come to TudorCon, you can actually see a pop-up apothecary and talk to people at the Herbalist Guild if that is your thing, which, I kind of think it is. If you've made it this far in the video and enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate a press of that like button. It helps to feed the algorithm and get our content to more people. And of course, I hope that I have earned your subscription to my channel where I put out content like this most days of the week. Also, if you enjoyed this day in the life of, I did do 24 hours in the life of a yeoman farmer, which was, maybe 8 months ago, not something like that. Anyway, that's something you might enjoy. You can check that out. Or on the screen, there's also going to be a video that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. Thank you so much for being here. Remember, my friend, you are deeply loved. I'm so glad I share the planet with you. You listening. Yes, you. You make the world a better place. And I'm grateful we got to spend this time together today talking about the Tudor stew mistress. I'll be back very soon. In the meantime, don't forget to drink your water.
Blow, northern wind, a scentful baby sweating. Blow, northern wind, blow, blow, blow. Ich hatte Bord in Bauerbricht, dat soll is Semlis und Sicht, Mensch, cool Meiden auf mich.